All right, are we live? We're good? Okay. So, hey, welcome. Those of you that are tuning in, we didn't really publicize this, but we're here in Edmonton, and we're sitting down with Simon Bennett. We're going to have a conversation around performance, general aspects of performance, and obviously, as you guys know, Simon is the co-creator of ViPR and ViPR PRO, and has vast experience in kind of performance and readiness training. And what I might start with is just a little bit of kind of where your journey is taking you in the last 5 or so years as it relates to preparedness and performance training.
Last 5 years or 20 years?
Wow. we can go 20, but then particularly in the last 5 years, because I would imagine that your trajectory has been pretty steady, and then what we've done, what you've done, what we've talked about has really morphed in the last number of years, hasn't it?
Well, as you know, I have invested a tremendous amount of time in the whole high performance arena. And so I'm director of high performance at the Edmonton Oilers, and I work with our strength and conditioning staff. And that is a space that I've been kind of really living and owning the last 5 years, but now transitioning into exciting concepts around high performance living and aspirational living. So,
and there's somewhat of a bridge between the two, is it not? You know, when you look at, let's say, the executive athlete versus the elite athlete that you deal with, although there are nuances and aspects that are very different, you map out similar aspects, do you not? I know we've talked about that before.
Yes, and I think that's where my passion is really driven, is recognizing what we're doing with elite level athletes and where things are moving in that direction, and saying, hey, why can't everyone get access to this? And so, you might call it high performance living, but some might call it high performance, and so really, it really doesn't matter. I mean, words are interchangeable.
Yeah, and as we engage in this discussion, some of you that are popping in, if you have any questions about what we're talking about, I'll get closer to the monitor, and we can definitely seek those out as we go along. But I want to start by asking you a question on just general stress load and then recovery. A good friend of ours, Brandon Marcello, talks about how it's very difficult physiologically to overtrain, but it's real easy to under-recover. And I know that when we deal with general clientele, when we deal with, in your case, you deal with more with elite athletes, give me some of your perspective on this idea of stress management, physiological and kind of physical stress management, and then recovery around that, and what you've kind of learned over the number of years.
Well, it's a very loaded question, because I think in high performance sports, you spend a lot of our time now is spent just trying to understand what the allostatic load is on an individual player. There's a lot of tracking and monitoring and sophisticated technologies that we're now using to try to understand that better. But we are always, sort of balancing, and as you know, there's a lot of contributors and pillars to what that looks like. At the end of the day, if somebody is undertrained but extremely stressed out, not managing their day-to-day, or they're not necessarily in a favorable position in the team, they're not playing well, that kind of stuff, those things can all add to that whole load factor that you're referring to. And so, but I think we typically try to look at, from a training perspective, we just talk about movement. I think we always try to look at work-in days and workout days. Right. So our work-in days are obviously very quality-driven. And then our workout days, but then on our work-in days, we're really looking at trying to sort of gently move the body back into restorative capacity. Right. So ViPR is one way to do that, and of course, all of the litany of devices and tools that are out there. So.
And we often look at, in our own schemes of 4Q, we've got a 4Q recovery that we often look at, and there's different phases of what we can do to manage the idea of recovery, be it through allied recovery exercise, like hot and cold contrasts, to elicit the vascular tree, to be able to vasodilate and vasoconstrict, to promote shock proteins for better outcomes of resiliency in the body, and just generally adding a lot more influence of parasympathetic tone. When it comes to movement, you talked about quality of movement, right? When you describe the idea of quality of movement, what does that mean in your world?
Well, I think we're always trying to get the athlete moving well, moving efficiently, because an athlete that's moving efficiently is obviously going to expend less, substrate. They're going to expend less energy. They're going to obviously be able to be more effective in their movements and that kind of thing. So, if we're talking about movement quality, we're looking at really trying to take the parking brake off the athlete. So if we've got overtension tissue, then we want to try and find strategies, and we can get into a laundry list of things that you can do in order to get there. But we do want to try and kind of help the athlete move well by kind of getting them out of tension into more of a relaxed state. We talk about the parasympathetic and sympathetic response. Those are all aspects, and that's not even just in training.
But I would imagine even on ice, like while I'm doing these high velocity, high threshold exercises, can I have sensitivity to be able to, upregulate and downregulate the system? Because, as we look at it from a physiological perspective, a simple way to look at it could be muscles that are highly engaged, slow, muscles off, turning off quick, fast, right? So on is slow and off is quick, right? And that goes to if I'm not playing well and the coach is on my back, or I'm an executive athlete, right? And I've got the burden of, a boss or a deadline or a project or whatever. That is still the burden that I carry. And everything begins to tighten up, and I don't have that, what you say, that relaxation. One of the things that you guys look at from a testing perspective is velocity as a readiness measure, right? What are some of the training considerations that you might think of to get an athlete to be able to, or an individual, to move better, to be able to get that muscle or that motor unit turned on and then turned off quickly? Because a lot of times in conventional approaches, it was time and attention, right? And that was great for cross-sectional area increase, but maybe not that good for speed and agility, right? So maybe speak a little bit about that from your perspective in terms of this idea of on and off and quickness and agility for good quality movement.
I think I think there's two pieces to this equation. One is when you look at a National Hockey League schedule, one aspect would be what am I doing to keep this athlete finely tuned, right? And every athlete is going to fall into a different category. Some athletes are experiencing more load, and so subsequently, you're talking about what do we do to tweak an athlete and make sure that they're getting the right amount of MVC or maximal contraction in order to be able to stay at that sort of that high level of function and performance, right? And I would suggest that the athlete really has to own themselves. And some of this comes through experience, but some of it comes through coaching and through obviously lending themselves a better understanding to what the technologies do and how we can. Some of it we track through heart rate, some of it we track through HRV, which is another measure for us to be able to actually kind of identify where the athlete is in terms of readiness. But most importantly, I think it is really done on an individual basis, and some of this is communicated to the coaching staff about what needs to be done. But if we're talking about off-season training, it's a completely different game. I mean, in terms of all of those things that you just highlighted, right? If you're talking about building speed or maximizing velocity development, we use a very, not that this is unique, but we use a very phased-in approach. And so we take the athlete and we make sure that they're moving well. You talk about efficiency, and then as we step them through, then we get them to the point where they can actually start to move at a higher velocity safely, so they can maximize some of that goal that they may be looking for. If it's to get faster, if it's to get stronger, to get more explosive, that kind of stuff. So we tap into that through that aspect. So there's two different sort of pieces here. One is what does an athlete do in season, and what do they do, to get better in the off season.
One of the things that you and I have spoken about in the past is what's required particularly from the hip joint, to be able to be a good skater. Now, we talk about, on this surface, we're gravity ground, we're into the ground. We're thinking about negative and positive angles as we plant and turn on the ground. Whereas with a hockey player, we're wearing a boot, right, that fixes the foot and ankle joints. So we lose the mobility necessary to really facilitate, and the foot itself, right? That puts a little bit more strain on the knee, particularly if the hip is not working very well. And then it's all about edging, right? So you accelerate out of turns because of centrifugal force, right? And so you talk to me about this idea that, even linear speed is all about edging, and it could be, these mini turns. And crossing over and stepping into a cross-step pattern actually ends up allowing the individual to have greater linear speed. And you talked about this ratio of, kind of 1 to 4 to 1 to 5 between outside steps or inside edge to this crossover step. And so I'm wondering if you can first talk about that, and then what we might do is talk about what's required at the hip, and then what we might do is equate it to what we can do from a movement piece under load to be able to kind of graduate that response into a positive adaptation, into a gain in that environment.
Well, I think, I would start from the ankle up, right, in terms of, answering that question. If you look at a hockey player, you take their foot out of a skate boot, right, they have very limited dorsiflexion, not in all cases, but in, I would say, probably 60% of players that is not optimal because of the reasons you highlighted in terms of being in the skate boot. In fact, the technology in the skate boot really keeps that ankle nice and rigid. It helps players skate faster, so it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? But it does take away from some of the mobility. So we start with the ankle, obviously, right in the off season, and you can see like the foot is completely fallen asleep. The athlete's ability to get to an end range is very limited, and so we use a number of different strategies and methods to try to help reestablish some of that stuff. But when you look at their stability or their strength at that end range as we go there, there's virtually nothing, and so you spend an entire summer trying to recapture that. And that's a big part of what goes on early in the summer development training program for any player, right? It doesn't matter where you're at, but most of them will have some degree of that. The other thing that I want to kind of talk about, I think, is what you kind of highlighted, which is the use of the skate blade and the angle and so on, and the crossover patterns. I think the most important thing is looking at torque within the various segments. So if you look at the ankle's ability to create torque, move in all three planes, it's like winding up a towel, and their ability to be able to actually do that is what really allows them to be able to express that velocity and that speed that you're talking about. All the players at a professional level are great. I mean, they've all got what you consider to be the requisite physical skill sets to be able to actually exceed and excel at this level. And really it's about just really trying to refine that player, right? But when you look at getting players up to that level, your approach is a little bit different, and you look for these kind of golden nuggets, things that you can try and change that are changeable. Because as you know, things like velocity and speed, some of it, is laid down at birth, right? And so, and some of that gets developed from age 8 to 13, 14 years of age. And it's not, you kind of miss that opportunity. And so all these things kind of get blended together in terms of how we try to progress an athlete through and get them to the point where they're actually developing more efficiency, developing more velocity, developing more power.
And I think part of that is in the architecture of our body. We need to physiologically move in these certain patterns of motion at particular joints of the body. And if we've got mobility, stability, and strength at the same time in these particular facets, then I would imagine we do know that the nervous system says, okay, there's less threat here. Therefore, we can engage more motor, efficiency, more intramuscular and intermuscular coordination. Because, as we're generating high degrees of force, it's under a platform of a safe base. And so, the idea of inside edge versus outside edge and what's required at the hip, right? So for instance, if you're a hockey player and you have to create, I can't skate doing this because the coefficient of friction is, it's virtually nuts. So I wouldn't get anywhere, right? So what I need to do is get a skate edge and an angle of attack into the ground, and then be able to propel myself forward. To that ability, I take my inside edge, which is basically an abducted, externally rotated, and extended scenario for this hip. And then when you described it to me, you said, okay, the crossover step is where I start to get that centrifugal action. But I take the outside edge in now, and I start to drive it into the ground, which is now requiring me to internally rotate, adduct, and extend, which if you look at the hips, we're winding the ligaments tighter, right? So we could have a restriction here that limits my ability to get into this joint position. And if I can't get into this position, I may not utilize my environment on the ice as well as I otherwise would for me to get maximal acceleration.
Or you'll go somewhere else and get it.
Or through the knee and the lower back, right? Right. Yeah. So this will be restricted. So I've got a torsion in my knee or my lower back. Do you often see them?
That's why lower back, groin, abdominal injuries are extremely high in hockey right now. And it's hugely problematic. So you're right. You will go somewhere else in your body if you can't do what you just want to be able to do. Right?
So what we would do in a scenario for, let's say we take a mass, in this case it's ViPR PRO, right? It doesn't matter, at the end of the day, there's a lot of good masses that we can use for external resistance. But what we can do is we can load a shift pattern that is asymmetrically driven on a framework that is saying, okay, we're going to take the joint and we're going to take it into different ranges of motion so that the mechanoreceptors at that joint sense different things, either velocity, tension, or both,
Yeah.
right? So that then we can coordinate a response and then over time an adaptation relative to the speed, the joint position, and the afferent efferent signaling that is occurring because of the fact that we're putting our athletes or individuals in this particular position, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know about you. Is there an exercise you want to go to?
Well, I think when we come to programming, I think, it's obviously very appropriate for me right now because we're now just starting to work with players and we're sort of in early phases of development, right? And so, when we talk about ViPR and how we incorporate ViPR into our overall training model, that becomes a very important starting point. And so there are a litany of approaches and a number of tools and methods that you can sort of get there with, right? But if you're talking about, like, for example, where we would slide this in, we would probably, in our first phase of general preparation, we would probably slide it in more on our movement series, right? And so what we're trying to do with the movement series is try to feed into a concept of really getting them to focus into a kind of an isometric or an end range hold position, right? So a simple drill that we would do to do that is using kind of the offset grip, right? On ViPR, we would step back into a 135-degree plane of motion, and then we would reach away, and we would encourage the athlete to actually create and take up all the slack in the system from that position.
Danny, I like that.
And then come out of that position.
Yeah, see, I like that because it's not predicated on movement as such, but what you're doing is you're saying, can I go to an end range, right? Can I go to a joint position, not joint motion, but can I go to a joint position and hold an isometric contraction so that I get stability, mobility, right? And that it's easier to coordinate because what I'm doing is I'm removing the motor complexity and I'm looking at the tissue and the afferent signaling and say, okay, I'm going to go to that end range, long under load. I'm going to add a shifting pattern, which is more tension-based than it is compression-based, right? They're both good, right? But this is more tension-based, so it's body-wide now. And I'm going to look at the architecture of going long under load as it relates to collagen and some of the other aspects that make me strong in a lengthened position. And say, from that joint position, can I just hold it? And can I create some structural robustness and some awareness that that joint position is going to be safe? Because, again, that mobility, stability, and that positional strength is what we're fostering. And I like that as a starting position.
And we like it, too, because, first of all, it's feeding into something that we're really trying to identify early on, right? You can get them to own. But it also offers some degree of transition. So they do have to transition it out. So there is a certain motor skill, there is a certain ability to be able to proprioceptively organize yourself so that you can actually figure out where your body is in space, right? And if there does need to be a correction, you can do it. Actually, it becomes self-driven. So you actually auto-correct yourself based on how you feel from that position. Right? We talked about the ankle joint, right? So when you're in that position, you're also trying to foster, greater range of motion through the ankle.
Can you do that again?
Yeah. So as we step into that position,
so right now,
we're really trying.
Well, you've got dorsiflexion here, but if you keep your foot flat here, you're also promoting now rear foot inversion and plantar flexion.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Instead of raising, and you could raise it up.
And personally, I never even really thought about it from that perspective. Sometimes we do a toe-up position,
which is great.
So there's a lot of different variabilities that you can offer. But we do focus on the loaded leg primarily in that drill. Just as an example.
But if you go back to that position, if you drive it, let's say back, you're going to get that loaded leg. But I would imagine that now your pelvis is going in one direction, and the mass is going in the opposite direction, and that has to be coordinated by your lumbopelvic hip complex, right? Because your crossroads is going to be right here, right?
Yeah.
Which I think that a lot of times in certain viewpoints of training, we tend to go where our pelvis is going, which is great, right? We load the hip. But a lot of times in sport, I would imagine in hockey, even in life, your body's going this way and the puck starts going that way, and you've got to react in that position. And it's really about ownership of and recognition through the nervous system and the muscular system, and then through the support, right? The collagen network, the fibrous connective tissue system, the skin, all of them can now contribute to that positive action of reacting to a chaotic play.
Well, it's something that you always talk about is odd position strength, right? I think that's what you're talking about. It's just really getting into odd positions. That's something that we build up into as we go through the model, right? As we go through the different phases of training.
So let me ask you this then on that. How do you reconcile, put some thought to this idea of perfect technique, right? Ideal technique to make you more efficient. We're going to train motion, kind of movement proficiency done in a certain way so we can optimize our technique. And we hold that to be true. And then we hold that against the idea that in sport, we're rarely in a perfect position to do a slap shot, we're not following that pattern of motion that is optimal because of the chaotic nature of a combative sport like the game of hockey. Right? So where does your mind go, and how do you begin to reconcile those two competing forces?
Yeah. Well, you got me actually thinking about something here, which is this notion that hockey players are not great athletes, because as soon as we put them into a dry line situation, we start to recognize that, oh my God, they have no hip flexion, they have no timing through the forefoot of the foot to be able to actually skip and hop on their feet. And so we automatically assume that player is not a great athlete. And it's actually the opposite. They are really the sum total of their adaptive martial. They don't move their ankles, right? They're not going to be effective at moving their hip through, greater than 90 degrees of range of motion, right? And so those are things we do try to restore. But it's interesting because the reason I bring it up is because, when we talk about this conversation of like what comes first, training functional ranges of movement or increasing function to a joint, right? And so we had a conversation in the car about this, and so we never really got into the details of it, but therein I think lies the whole chicken and the egg theory, which is what do you improve first, right? Do you improve through a what's called quote unquote functional movement rather, the problem or the motor control issue or whatever may be happening, or do you increase the joint function itself? So if my hip is compressed inside the acetabulum, right? When I go into that bottom position, you're going to find that I'm actually going to hit that end range, and then so subsequently my knee is going to dive in, or because of the limitation of my ankle, I'm going to move out of the position that I'm in into something that's going to allow me to continue to keep doing what you want me to do, which is to go further. Right? And so I think that's where training is at right now, and it's really quite interesting. And I think obviously you're going to see it from your perspective in terms of the importance and the role of fascia, in terms of how we train the body and the systems and the movement of it.
And if we look at your idea of if the joint expression cannot be there, the functional movement task could actually be disruptive in time. Right? So in other words, if I'm encouraging internal rotation for whatever reason, and I can't get posterior glide in that hip joint, then I'm beating up the labrum. Now the problem with that is it's asymptomatic, right? So I'm not going to feel it until I've got a tear, right? And that's the problem. Right? And so I like where you're going with the idea that if we can improve the dynamics of the joint so that whatever movement is coming in its functional space, what if it's for hockey players, then what we're doing is we're saying we're giving you the space required at a certain segment to be able to articulate or exert properly for us to complete that task efficiently. And I would imagine that there are efficiency elements to this conversation as well that then ensue. And then your idea of, hey, listen, I want to make them effective and efficient, but at the end of the day, if they're injured, then that's a big one for you. And I think that's one thing that you and I have talked about is what you're really trying to address is through an 82 game schedule, 84, 82, it's managing the overall allostatic load, which is travel and time zone changes and dehydration on planes and the stress of the environment, stress, physicality of contact, and looking at all that and saying, can we actually manage injury rates? Because if we can, then these players, even operating at 90%, right, in terms of fatigue, let's say, if they're still able to give it and they're not injured, that's better.
I think it's a big animal in terms of the full understanding of where to go and how to go with that. I like keeping it simple in terms of like we started with an end range exercise that incorporated the use of an isometric contraction. But I think that's one way that you get at this joint limitation, right? So we are using a functional movement pattern, but at the same time we're also using an isometric contracted state in order to hopefully get tissue to lay down along that line so that we can help create some joint, improve the range of motion or recapture maybe a loss of what we may have had originally in there, whether it's 5, 6, 7 years ago. That's just a great example.
And I think we talk to the mechanoreceptors when we do that. too. So, all the joint proprioceptors, they start, not only are we laying down material, but we're talking to a lot of the proprioceptors in terms of what they are able to facilitate in response to range of motion, stability, and ultimately load. So that's great. Shifting gears a little bit, when it comes to, we obviously could talk about this idea of first step quickness. Right? Typically, how would you approach an individual who wants to gain speed? A lot of times we talk about this idea of creating acceleration first, and then deceleration next, because we're breaking into chunks, and then conversion last, which is plyometrics, right? And the reason why we might say that is acceleration, muscles are acting. Deceleration, they're being acted upon, which is more challenging for the neuromuscular system because it has to react quicker, and there's a lot more force introduced to the system. Right? Think of all the deceleration problems that we have, formation, distortion, and others. Typically, we get injured during deceleration. So we would accelerate first, right? From the dead starts, we call them dead starts, right? So we would do some dead starts to teach acceleration. Then, in the next phase, however long that takes, we would do decels, and then we'd start to convert them through that amortization phase of plyometric action. And we can, and now I can showcase some exercise there. But I'm wondering how you guys approach that with an elite athlete.
Well, we use Cal Dietz's model with triphasic, to try to get at some of that through the weight room. So we'll obviously put a big emphasis on building the eccentric strength and then the isometric strength. And there's a lot of debate on what you do first, right? Whether it's the isos. Cal has you start with an eccentric component, but there's probably a lot of literature out there that would say you start isometrically first and then start building the eccentric, right? And so I think at the end of the day, you're going to find yourself in a better position regardless of what the approach is. But, triphasic is what we use. The other thing that we really try to emphasize is trying to continue to maximize the speed of movement. So even in the weight room, when you're loading into a position, you're loading into that position quickly. And so that's really training the nervous system. It's training the motor engrams that are happening. So really you're prepping that along the way. The other thing that we do is we do a lot of oscillatory movement, which is like flicking a light switch on and off. And so from an end range position, you'll actually get the individual to, from a disadvantaged position, actually turn the muscle on, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off very quickly.
Give me an example.
Just so for example, if I'm in, I can do it with an implement. And then of course, obviously there'd be different training adaptation if it's heavier, obviously. But if I'm just using my body weight, I would have the athlete pull down into a very bottom end position. So we'll call it an end range. And then from there, they would push up, pull down, push up, pull down, push up, pull down, and stay as quick as they can with that motion in an effort to try to help improve their ability to be able to absorb load quickly and then be able to channel that into a positive force, right?
So shortening that amortization phase.
The other thing that we are, I would say, hyper interested and focused on, much like the track community, is understanding what happens in terms of an ability to create stability, right? So as an example, when I'm running down a track, as soon as my foot enters the floor, the faster that I can take up all the slack in the system and create stability off that leg, it's going to give me that much more of an ability to be able to generate power from that position, right? And I always use the example of like kicking a soccer ball. So if I'm going to kick a soccer ball, and I want to kick that soccer ball a little bit further, right? I've got to create more stability around that ankle joint in order to be able to whack that leg through a little bit faster, create that centrifugal force to be able to knock the ball farther. And so, we're always curious as to how that gets trained. A lot of people go to core training when they do that. But what we find is we actually, the functional movements themselves, when you ask the athlete to move faster, which challenges them to, from a neuromuscular standpoint, attenuate the movement quickly, stop that movement, and then reverse that movement in the opposite direction, you automatically train the core, right? And so that's, I think,
it's task-driven.
It's task-driven. So there's a functional movement attached to it, but more importantly, there's an emphasis on urgency, which is I've got to pull myself into the bottom position as quickly as I can, and then pull myself out. So the example of the oscillatory movement, right? It's just really teaching the athlete to switch on and switch off very quickly, and it's a timing thing. It's a learned thing. And so the more that you ingrain that training through the process, the easier it is. And when you get the athlete at the end of the summer, hopefully they're faster, they're quicker, they're more explosive, and they're able to generate expressive power.
Yeah, we do an oscillatory measure. It's just a tilt pattern. It's just about driving, right, for reverberation through the body. But it's really about an either a split leg stance, right, or a single leg stance, and it's just about that drive, and can I have the capacity to be able to attenuate, right, in both directions, a force, and manage it through the kinetic chain, as it reverberates back into my body. And then we can actually pick this up, and there's been a lot of good, there's 3D athletes, which post a lot of stuff, and they're great on Instagram. And they do a lot of acceleration moves, right, where they use different implements, including ViPR PRO. And they're driving in different patterns to try to create what you're talking about for their athletes.
Yeah, no. The other thing is, too, is we push sleds a lot, right, because of what you're talking about in terms of, being able to put that foot into the ground faster, be able to create that tension and to be able to drive to the next leg, right? And it does transfer well to skating.
That's great. I don't know if there's any questions here, but certainly a lot of comments. As we kind of wrap this up, and I appreciate your time, Simon, but if we're taking a look at, and I'll go back to our kind of first narrative, which is, this idea of the farm kid using kind of sub-maximal loads with degrees of freedom and variability, and then offering, a profile of loading that is variable to create odd position strength. I'm wondering if you so this idea of farm kids being stronger on the puck, in the environment. Do you tend to still see that, or is it starting to morph as it relates to athletes in the game? Because I would imagine many more players are coming from urban centers than 20 years ago.
There's still a percentage of kids that come from the farm, but you're right. You're starting to see these tech-savvy kids, the millennials, right, that aren't growing up on farms, and that are getting exposed to different environments. And you're right, we use the analogy, and I think for the most part, when we were having the conversation originally, it was because the best hockey players in the world were coming from Saskatchewan, right? We're doing a lot of farming in Alberta, and so, so that works for the analogy. But I would say that what we're seeing is we're seeing more injuries because the game is faster and it's much more rigorous. There's many more levels to it, but the athletes are much more sophisticated in terms of how they physically prepare. You'll hear athletes from the older generation saying that the young kids today that are now in the gyms training are boring because they're so disciplined and so hyper-focused on the things that they need to do in terms of developing all the pillars so that they can obviously perform at the highest possible level. So, but to answer your question, I think we're always going to see that challenge that, there's never not enough stability, right? We're always looking at trying to make athletes more stable. I have several young kids right now that I'm working with that you see it right out of the gate. As soon as you introduce a young kid into a group of players who've been training 4 or 5 years with you and have been building that requisite, hard drive over those years, you're seeing a big difference in terms of their aggregate stability. Those kids would typically describe it as old man strength versus young man strength, right? The young man's strength just isn't as sophisticated, isn't as developed. In the old days, we used to call it the farmer, right? And they had that development, right? So,
do you see with athletes, do you see certain injuries that are more pronounced than others? Is it typically, it's almost like a signature, like you see certain aspects breaking down? Is that the case in the game of hockey? There's certain go-to areas that break down more than others?
You're right. It's very interesting. Like, I think in the course of a year, every year it almost seems like you get a preponderance of stuff that just kind of goes off your radar screen and now comes back on, right? But I think there's no secret that the exposure is the low back, right, and the hips, right, in the players, and the shoulders, of course, right, and the shoulders because of the postural change that happens over time, and then subsequently when they do get hit, they are getting hit, but they just don't have that requisite ability to attenuate forces. So,
and the rub there is they may need that stiffness for the play, but if they find themselves in that position, it's like the ankle, right? No dorsiflexion, but that ability to be stiff might give them the extra spring to be able to be more powerful.
Right? Well, one of the things that we've come across too is this whole thing of the hip, and what is the issue? Is if I've got an Irish hip, as we say, or if I've got a Finnish hip is shaped differently in the pelvis, and so if you look at all the Finns, they can squat deep, they can get ass to grass in their squatting positions, right? Looks really impressive from an Olympic lifting standpoint, but these Irishmen, right, that are coming that have a shallow hip, very unstable, inability to be able to actually get into a deep squat position. have difficulty crossing over, which can be potentially problematic. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, because that's something that, that's kind of on our radar screen a little bit too, in terms of how you train that and how you treat that.
Well, when it comes to a squat and the ability to squat, a lot of times we can just thank our anatomy for that. Right, to a certain degree. And I think to your point, we can work around it to some degree, but sometimes our shape is our shape. Right? And if we want to try to contribute a greater degree of effort or motion, it may contribute from the wrong area. And I think that the abilities for any individual, right, the executive athlete that sits too much, or the high performing athlete that has a lot of stress load surrounding their physical stress of their sport, needs to be accommodated in a very bio-individualized way, which is not a great answer because it depends on the individual, but it really depends. It's important for us to be able to look at that and recognize that there are differences. And at the end of the day, we always try to go to a certain standard. Like, this should be the archetype of the perfect model. And we see evidence of it that is different all the time. Right? Usain Bolt shouldn't sprint the way he does because he's not the right archetype for a sprinter, and yet he was. Right? Because he utilized what he had to a greater degree. So, Anyway, so listen. Thanks, buddy. So listen, if you've got questions, appreciate your attention. Please write them down. We can get to them at a later date. This is going to be posted so you can view it after. And we're going to enjoy the rest of our Sunday having dinner. So appreciate you guys making the time and the effort. And please put your comments below and we'll get back to you. So thanks again, Vince. Thanks.
Kept going off.